The Golden Arm. The Golden Arm holds a special place in my heart as the first ghost story to truly frighten me. To my best knowledge, Mark Twain first popularized the tale, he himself having learned it from an African-American oral tradition. I first heard this story on a Cub Scout camping trip when I was around 8 years old. One of my pack's adult leaders was a superb storyteller, and I could still remember the wonder, suspense, and fright I felt sitting at the crackling campfire hearing the Golden Arm for the first time, and how little sleep I got that night. I recommend that whoever reads this story out loud to a group do so only after familiarizing oneself with the text, especially the critical ending scare. Then, when it's time to tell the story, sit close to someone you want to startle. This particular telling of the tale is of course my own words and details, as there is a fair deal of room for embellishment, but draws heavily from the first glorious, terrifying version I heard as a child. The Golden Arm by G.R. Wilson. In 1800s Georgia, there lived a wealthy young woman in a grand plantation house. The woman's name was Annabelle Walters, and she inherited her fortune from her father, who made his money in cotton farming. Her father had been cruel to his slaves, but tender to his wife and daughter. In 1864, baby Annabelle almost died in a fire set by William Sherman's soldiers on their march to the sea. Her mother saved her from death, but could not save her left arm, which was so badly burned it had to be amputated. The rest of Annabelle's body and her pretty face remained unscathed, but her father wanted the replacement for her arm to be as beautiful and perfect as the rest of her. So when Annabelle was a teenager, her father had an arm cast out of solid gold, and everyone marveled at how shiny and yet how lifelike Annabelle's new arm was, even if it was cold and artificial. Annabelle's mother died of fever not long after the casting of the Golden Arm, and a few years after that her father died in a steamboat explosion, and so young lovely Annabelle Walters lived by herself in her family's old mansion, with only an old dog named Ranger to keep her company. Of course, many bachelors wanted to marry Miss Walters for her wealth. They talked of love and affection, but Annabelle was no fool, and turned down many a scheming suitor. George was different. His family didn't come from wealth. He had been a self-made rancher out west, but most importantly, he truly loved Annabelle for who she was, not for her money. The two wed and shared several happy years. Then, one dreary October, Annabelle fell sick with the same fever that killed her mother. The doctors, the best and most expensive doctors in the country, did all they could, but could not save her. By mid-November, lovely Annabelle lay on her deathbed, her beloved George beside her in the final hours. "George, darling, before I pass, I have one last request to impart upon you," she said. "Yes, my darling, anything. What is it?" he replied. "My arm. My golden arm. It is my most precious possession, more important to me than this house or any of my jewelry. Please, bury me in the ground with my golden arm," said Annabelle. "Yes, Annabelle, if that is what you desire, I shall," said George. "Promise me, George. It is my final will upon this earth," she said. George gulped before replying. "I promise to bury you with your golden arm, darling." Annabelle fell silent and was dead within a few minutes. George and a few of Annabelle's cousins were the only one to attend her funeral, and when she was buried in the Walters Farm Cemetery down the road from the mansion, in accordance with his wife's last wish, George buried Annabelle with her golden arm. The night following the burial, George was sitting in front of his fireplace, Ranger the dog asleep at his side. He thought about his future, his love life, his living arrangements. And then he thought of his financial situation. Neither him, nor of course Annabelle, had worked a day their entire marriage. The Walters family fortune had paid for all they wanted. But that money, between the doctor's fees and Annabelle's lavish headstone, was nearly gone. George had become lazy and accustomed to the leisured life. If only he had another source of wealth. Then he remembered. The golden arm. That arm was made of solid gold and must be worth a small fortune itself, he thought, but it was already buried with its owner, as per her final will. But wouldn't Annabelle want him to be happy and not destitute? And hadn't she been a bit delirious towards the end with that fever thrashing about her brain? Surely, George thought, the poor woman wasn't even thinking straight towards the end, and now she was dead and could not care whether she was buried with a golden arm or not. George made a decision. He put on his cloak, for the air was chilled that November night, and he brought a lantern, for the sky and the road were dark as a cave. He creaked open the door to the tool shed and grabbed the shovel, the strongest looking one he could find, for he would have 6 feet down to dig through cold, hard ground. The sky was filled with clouds. No moon nor stars greeted George on his solitary march to Annabelle's grave. The wind whispered through the grass, and the naked branches like the voices of creatures best unseen. George hugged his cloak tight around him, and he held his lantern high. Within his tiny circle of yellow light, shadows danced like madmen, and George felt his heart quicken as he approached the cemetery. George found the right headstone and plunged his shovel into the hard earth. The work got harder with each shovelful of dirt, but George worked faster as the wind picked up, and he shivered, thinking of the fire back inside. Sooner than George expected, the shovel thud against the wood. George cleared away the final layer of soil and opened the coffin. There lay Annabelle, as fair and beautiful as the prime of her life, clasping across her chest. Her golden arm shimmered in the lantern light, pushing aside flimsy thoughts of betrayal and robbery. George snatched the arm and slammed the coffin shut. The arm was cold as ice, and George set it beside him as he shoveled the dirt back on top of his wife. Then he scooped up his treasure and began the long walk back to the house. The wind grew stronger and stronger as he walked, gusting against his cloak and making the lantern sway in his hand. The wind whistled, and George thought he had heard a voice, carried high and faint across the fields. He froze, eyes wide, glanced to one side and then the other. He saw no one. But with each step on the frosty ground, the wind's voice grew more distinct. Who's got my golden arm? George hurried his walk, but the words followed him, louder and louder. Who's got my golden arm? The terrified man at least reached the mansion's door, which he flung open, slammed, and locked behind him. He ran to the parlor, where Ranger's ears perked up, and the friendlier hound greeted its master. The fire was down to embers, but even that small heat felt wonderful as George dropped his shovel and sat down. Then he heard the ghastly voice again. Who's got my golden arm? George couldn't place the sound's source. It seemed to come from the chimney, the windows, the door all at once. He clutched the heavy golden arm close to himself and ran to the windows to shut the curtains, but still, the forlorn and angry cry continued. "Who's got my golden arm?" Ranger barked and growled at the east wall, the one facing the cemetery. The wind made the boards of the house creak and groan, and the windows rattled, and the voice went on louder than ever. "Who's got my golden arm?" A gust of wind came straight down the chimney and put out the embers. Then George ran with the golden arm upstairs and down the hall to his bedroom, his heart thumping and his teeth clattering. Ranger's bark boomed, and then was overpowered by the slam of the front door being blown off its hinges, and the wind screamed through the house. "Who's got my golden arm?" George threw himself under the bedsheets, clutched the icy, cursed golden arm, and it felt heavy as iron, and he could feel the wind slam open the bedroom door. Then the wind stopped, and there was silence. Followed by slow, shuffling steps and tiny thuds as pieces of frozen grave dirt fell to the floor. George felt his breath and prayed. Silently, George held his breath and prayed silently as the ghastly footsteps stopped just next to the bed. "Who's got my golden arm? You've got it!"